Okay, if everybody can take their seats, we're going to start. I do feel like a traffic cop, just trying to keep us on schedule, but I know you're a bit tired. I hope it was a great conversation with Elton. And it will blend in some ways, into our next panel, which is all about, we're calling it second stage reform, community-based rehabilitation. I'll let the panelists and the moderator explain exactly what's meant by that, but I want to introduce the panel, the moderator first. It's a really great honor to have with us Vinny Schiraldi, or formerly Vincent Schiraldi, who many of you may know or may have heard about, but he's one of the leading lights right now in the movement for reform of community supervision and youth, and he's been a leading figure in the Rikers campaign to close Rikers, and he's also been instrumental in the idea of closing youth detention facilities around the country. He's also, I'm very glad to say, a regular contributor to the Crime Report. One of his most amazing columns in this year was he went on a trip to Europe and visited youth facilities in Germany and Netherlands and Croatia, and came up with some really inspiring ideas. Shows how much better they're doing than we are. So I highly recommend you go back in our archives and look at those articles. But formerly, Vinny he's got a long train of credits to his name. He was commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation. He was director of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services for the District of Columbia. He is now a senior research scientist. Sorry.
That sticks a micro too.
Right. At Columbia School of Social Work, and he's co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia U. So I'll let him explain what that is. Vinny, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to try to speed date so that you can get to the questions, which I think is the more fun part of it all. And I've asked every member of the panel to introduce themselves before they say their comments. So I'll say some quick stuff and get out of the way. I know this is going to be a panel on community-based rehabilitation, programs for kids in lieu of confinement. But I want to say a little bit about confinement before I turn it over to the panelists who'll talk about what we can do instead, just to kind of put the conversation into perspective, and I apologize if I'm repeating a lot of what's been said. Big build-up to the number of kids getting locked up through the mid to late 90s, the super predator era, a time where with very veiled, if at all veiled, racial overtones to our incarceration of juveniles. For a big chunk of it, 80% of the increase in the number of kids locked up were kids of color. So almost the entire increase in the build-up to about 109,000 kids locked up, to 250,000 kids being tried as adults, to 10,000 kids being locked up in adult prisons and jails, was on the backs of kids of color. But now, the good news is there's been a 50+% decline in the number of kids in locked custody. I think the number of kids in adult facilities is down around 3,000. Number of kids being tried as adults is down around the 70s, 76,000, which is an estimate. And it'll drop even further when New York kicks its raise the age law in, and a couple other states. So lots of bad news followed by some good news. Part of that is the increase in the number of programs that are available and the increase in sophistication and learning about those programs. Part of it is a reframing of kids in the system as less than fully culpable and very malleable, and the panels will speak about that. Lots of research was done that helped shift the narrative in some respects, interestingly, in response to the super predator epithet, because part of the conversation there was that if you do the adult crime, you should do the adult time. So it was really kind of a, part of that was an advocacy and philosophical question, but part of it was a research and testable question. Are kids really different enough to warrant this special thing called a juvenile court, or aren't they? And some of that was testable, and research showed, lo and behold, yes, they are different in very important ways that matter in a legal perspective. They're more malleable, they're more susceptible to peer pressure and peer influence, more volatile and emotionally charged settings, and less future-oriented. And all of that is extended and worse if they've suffered trauma, which more than half of the kids coming into facilities have. So big pushback, lots of research, lots of innovation, and lots of advocacy by advocates around the country, and then some open-minded elected officials and appointed officials have all kind of combined and conspired, along with a pretty profound decline in a number of, and the amount of juvenile crime, have all sort of helped reduce the number of kids we have in locked custody. We had a really cool experiment with that here in New York. We used to have 1,500 kids in placement, two-thirds decline by the year 2012, down to about 500, and now we're down to just a little over 100 after having passed an initiative called Close to Home. And so now nobody from New York City's family court goes to anything resembling a youth prison anymore. They're all kept locally in the 5 boroughs. This is the family court. Still kids that go from the adult court, but nobody in family court goes to youth prison. They all go to 6-bed homes, 8-bed homes. I think the biggest one is 18 beds, and they're all run by nonprofit organization within the 5 boroughs or very close to the 5 boroughs. So that's a pretty complete deinstitutionalization of the family court, and it's been associated with 50+% decline in youth crime since 2012, about twice the decline in the previous 4 years, and a more substantial decline than the rest of New York State, which did not have Close to Home. So it wasn't a jailbreak. I'm not saying it caused that decline in crime, but it would be hard to argue that it was a jailbreak. And that came with its own continuum of care. But I'm not going to talk about that because these folks are going to do a better job of talking about that than I could. It's just that these things are yin and yang of each other. The number of kids we have in locked custody can be impacted by the quality and size of the programs that we have in the community. And conversely, if we spend all our money locking kids up, we don't have the money to buy the kinds of programs that it's going to take to help kids not get locked up. So that having been said, I think we decided scientifically to go in alphabetical order. And so Shaena's going to start. Oh, I'm sorry, alphabetical, that's you. Sorry about that. That's why I didn't win the ABC award in grammar school.
We wondered if you were going to do my first name or last name, so we were just ready.
There you go.
And
Okay.
we were ready.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for having us. My name is Sino Estepan. I'm a research analyst in the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center. And we do a range of work that runs the gamut in the criminal justice system. We do work on policing, crime prevention, victimization, juvenile justice, and my particular area of focus is on school discipline and on juvenile justice. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of juvenile probation in dismantling juvenile probation. And that might seem a little odd, but there are quite a number of counties around the country that are invested in this work. So I want to talk about the Annie Casey Foundation's work on transforming juvenile probation and put a spotlight on one particular county that's made innovative strides in making this work happen in Lucas County in Ohio. I think it's a very newsworthy county that deserves a lot of attention. Lucas County, just to give a little context on who they are and what they're about, Lucas County is a pretty medium-sized city. It's in Toledo, Ohio, and their juvenile court in 2012, a third of kids were sent to prison because they violated a condition, or one of their probation conditions, and half of those youth were assessed as low or medium risk, meaning in the traditional sense of public safety, meaning they posed low risk to public safety. And much like other counties around the country, racial disparities in that county were high. So over a third of black youth with felony cases received out-of-home placements compared to 7% of white youth in that year. So let's fast forward to 2014, 2015, 2016, after Lucas County began working with the Casey Foundation on their juvenile probation transformation work. In late 2015, leaders in the Lucas County Juvenile Court met and started talking about their capacity and about the kinds of youth who are touching the front door of the system. And during one of their meetings, one of the head judges said something along the lines of, why are youth who are adjudicated with misdemeanors on probation? And that kind of set off this light bulb moment for the county. And it prompted the county in April of 2016 to develop a misdemeanor services unit. So youth who are adjudicated as misdemeanors and charged with first-time nonviolent felony offenses are referred to the misdemeanor services unit by the bench, and misdemeanor services unit staff, who are former probation officers, engage with family members and with youth and refer them to services that are in the community themselves. Youth aren't ordered to these services, and there's no sanctioning for non-attendance. Most of these cases are closed around after 120 days from disposition. And when we talked to them in the spring of 2018, by that point, so from April of 2016 to the spring of 2018, by that point, 175 cases were served by the Misdemeanor Services Unit in Lucas County, and only 18, so around 10%, returned to the court and were ordered to probation for new offenses. And part of what made this model work is that Lucas County had community assets that they were able to leverage so that youth could be de-institutionalized and sort of be sent, and that they could use the community to help youth thrive. So, there are a number of other examples around the country that are doing this kind of work, but I think Lucas County is one that deserves quite a lot of attention for their work in this way.
Any data on what happened since?
Well,
You're saying basically no kids that have misdemeanor charges get put on probation?
10%.
10%. Any data on what happened outcome-wise? Is it kids that aren't getting?
Yep.
Are the kids who aren't getting put on probation doing any worse, better? What's the...
Sure, yeah. Well, the kids who are...
Go back, they report.
Sure, well, the kids who are... we have not done an outcome and evaluation as of yet because the Probation Transformation Initiative is in its nascency. So it began in 2014, and we started our evaluation in late 2017, early 2018. And one of the important things one of the bad things that happens with research is that we tend to, there's this mad rush to produce outcome data and to produce numbers. And these sorts of things take time to be able to sort of produce something that's showing its effectiveness. So the answer to your question is no. As of yet, there's no data. But stay tuned. Maybe there will be.
Thank you, Sino. I'll introduce myself. I'm Shaena Fazal. I oversee policy and advocacy at Youth Advocate Programs. And we are an alternative to institutional placement for kids in various systems, including the juvenile justice system. And we're one of the partners in Lucas County, Ohio, that helped keep kids in the community and out of facilities. And I do know one outcome from the assessment center. They also created an assessment center to kind of divert kids, not just misdemeanants, but all kids. And that has resulted in a reduced number, lesser disparity, at least. There were higher numbers of kids, like all the kids coming from school were pretty much African-American kids. So when they started using the assessment center more, that kind of stopped. But so I just wanted to, it was a nice segue that you started with Lucas County. So like I said, my name is Shaena, and I have 3 things that I want to talk about today in my 10 minutes that I have. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first one, and that is that we believe at YAP, and I think most of us on this stage, that even though we've had great success in New York with close to home, that we can actually bring kids all the way safely home, even young people who commit serious and violent offenses, that things happen incrementally and in stages, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that ball, that we can definitely bring kids all the way home. And so what does this mean? How do we do that? How do we focus on thinking about what do kids need, what do families need, what do communities need? So just a few things off the top of my head, and then I'm going to give you some examples. Number 1 is individualized services and intensive supports for the young person and their entire family. The second is thinking about building competencies, the positive youth justice model that I think you may have heard of earlier today. Thinking about kids and what are they good at, having a strength-based approach to use things that they excel at, that they're interested in, to help build an intervention that works for them, and not using the cookie-cutter approach. Somebody on the panel right before lunch talked about cookie-cutter doesn't work. Thinking about families, too. A lot of programs are just focused on the kid, and we don't think about, kids come from families, and sometimes families don't do right by their kids, so to speak. Kids will always gravitate back to their biological family, regardless of what has happened. So it really behooves us to actually do that work with the entire family and not just with the young person. Cultural competency, another really important piece, that our young people are able to connect and engage with whomever it is that's working with them. That could be shared values, shared mores, shared experiences. It doesn't necessarily have to be just race, and also linguistic competency. And then being available when families need you, so that it's not a program that's just from 8:30 to 4:30 when most people are at work and they can't show up anyway. And then I think the other part is those are some of the elements for the young person and their family, but then there's the piece for the community and the young person, and that is giving kids the opportunity to repair harm, thinking about implementing restorative justice practices, of course addressing trauma. The other panel right before lunch covered that pretty well, so I won't belabor it. And also giving kids an opportunity to just give back to the communities where they live, so they feel tethered to someplace where they actually belong, and an opportunity then to thrive. And what we have now doesn't really get us here, right? Because the epicenter of all our justice systems is this really expensive, really ineffective prison. So I guess as reporters you might ask, well, that's great. These all sound like awesome concepts, great things to do. Has it been done any place? What does it look like, and has it worked? So I wanted to provide you with 2 examples. One is Marion County, Indiana, which is Indianapolis. We're engaged in a Pay for Success program there that's funded partially by Marion County government and partially by foundations. And our metrics that we were supposed to do there was reduce the number of bed days paid by the system for kids to be kids would be either incarcerated in a youth prison or in a residential facility. 21 months into the funding, we had 43 kids in the program. They were moderate to high-risk kids who otherwise would have been locked up. So these were all kids that were adjudicated and would have been committed to some type of facility. So they weren't like low-risk kids that were it wasn't a project where we were creaming the kids or anything like that. So 21 months into the funding, I should say the cost of the bed per day was $242.51. And the target was to save 1,649 bed days per year, or $32.98 total for 2 years. 18 months in, we ended up saving 6,893 bed days, which is, we overshot our target, and more than 75% of the kids in our program were living safely in the community, so they hadn't committed another offense that would have got them locked up or sent away. So I just wanted to give that as an example, that we achieved that, and as a result of this like blended funding stream, because a lot of times systems will say we want to do this, but we don't have the money. So as a result of this blended funding stream, now they had a cost savings for almost 7,000 days, and now they are looking to like share this statewide outside of just Marion County, so that other counties in Indiana can also benefit from a program like this that treats kids safely in the community instead of in an institutional setting. The other one I'll mention really briefly is Chicago. And this was just reported in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. It's an anti-violence program, but it largely is dealing with the same population of young people that we talk about in the justice system. And in that program, it was a combination of our model, which is we do wraparound services, and advocacy, which is really paid mentoring. People from the community, GED to PhD is their qualification. They're not really clinical in nature. But we partnered up with another organization that did provide trauma services. That was like therapy type of services for young people to address, identify their trauma, and deal with their trauma. And this is being studied by the University of Chicago Crime Lab. 18 months in, the preliminary data shows that the arrest rate for violent crimes among participants in this program have been cut in half. And most kids in the program were not in school, and they're in school now. And one of the advocates in the program was quoted as saying, "You can't do school and the streets." And they work together to get those kids back into school. And both of these programs I just wanted to mention because I think we tend to overlook it, that there's a racial justice component to it. How kids of color get treated is worse in both situations and in the system overall. So I just didn't want to leave that out. And so when we were talking about, Vinny mentioned cost. You know, there's a website and a study that talks about the $1 million blocks in Chicago. You might be familiar, Carolyn. There's 800, just to give you the stats, it's shocking, right? There are 851 blocks in Chicago that spend over $1 million on sending people to prison. 851 blocks that spend over $1 million to send people to prison. There's 121 blocks that spend over $1 million to send people to prison for nonviolent offenses only. I mean, these numbers are staggering. So as long as we are spending money and have these $1 million blocks, we're not going to be able to fund the programs. These programs are all that we know work are all going to be underfunded. So my last 2 points, I'll be very quick, is risk aversion. I feel like people are always saying that governments don't like to take risks. A lot of the innovative things we see are really funded by private entities and not by the government. But I want to challenge that because I feel like the riskiest thing government can do is send kids to prison. And so they're not risk averse. They're only risk averse when it comes to what we do in the community. And as reporters, I think it's really important that you raise that challenge to policymakers when you're dealing with youth incarceration. And then the last piece is just that we really don't need any new facilities. As we close down facilities, we don't have to just think about, now what do we replace that facility with? What kind of building do we need? How can we perfect this? How can we put lipstick on this pig, right? We don't need to create those things. What we need to do is reinvest the dollars we're spending on things we know that don't work, that are the riskiest things we can do for our young people, and instead spend that money in the community. And I know I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about my pet peeves later. Thank you.
Did you want to do a question before I jump in, or can I jump in?
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Carolyn Frazier. I'm a juvenile defense attorney and a clinical law teacher at Northwestern in the great city of Chicago. Is anybody here reporting from Chicago? Excellent. Somebody else? Okay, we got 2 folks. Okay, so then you guys know as well as I do that Trump would have us envision Chicago as the epicenter of human carnage, I think is the phrase that gets used, full of stereotypical thugs. I was reading something recently, and I love what, it's Elton, right, said at luncheon about language, and I think that would be one of my biggest pet peeves, and also one of my biggest pleas to you guys is to be aware of this and where it's used. So I was reading about how Trump uses communities in Chicago as a rhetorical problem that triggers something pathological in the public's mind. And I do think that's what we think about when we think about juvenile justice in Chicago. But despite Trump's rhetoric, the reality is that while we do have, I'm not diminishing the problem that we have with gun violence or the fact that we do have youth who do sometimes commit serious crimes, and I represent them in sex offenses and murder and the kids who come through the system in that way. The reality is that the great majority of our arrests in the city of youth are for low-level offenses. So we're not a great data-keeping town or city or state, for that matter, Illinois. But for the last year, I could get my hands on good, reliable arrest data of youth. 2016, a full 75% of the arrests of youth we're making in Chicago were for misdemeanors or municipal ordinance violations. 75%, 3/4. Another way, in my mind, to look at many, if not most, of these misdemeanor and municipal ordinance arrests is that we're taking typical and even normative youth behavior, and we are pathologizing it and criminalizing it. And I think that needs to be said, and I wish there was more reporting on that. This is also true of some felonies, by the way, and I won't sit here and tell you war stories, but I can tell you, if you want to talk later, about all the kids I've represented in felony court for ridiculous things. Things like taking a pink flamingo and throwing it in your group home when you're an abused kid, breaking a ceiling tile, and getting charged with felony criminal damage to government-supported property. These are not outliers. So when you hear felony, you also shouldn't be thinking, oh my God, this kid is really dangerous, or any threat to public safety. Unfortunately, we have a very wide net. But once you arrest a kid, no matter if it's for an ordinance violation, a misdemeanor, a felony, you have created a criminal history for that kid. And to me, the system has had an impact right there. We might think of those kids as not even being in the system, but they absolutely are. And I don't know how much folks in the room know about arrest records or the life and impact of arrest records on kids' lives. There's better reporting on it lately, I think. But I always think about it in terms of myth versus reality, that the myth is that people think these things don't matter, particularly for kids, and the reality is the opposite. These things are following kids into adulthood. They get out, they get shared in a variety of ways, both legal and not. The Tough on Crime, the 90s, we had a big reduction in the confidentiality protections for kids' records, and record sharing went up a lot, and that's continued to happen. And even for mere arrests that don't get referred to court, what we're seeing is that these are hindering youth's ability to get jobs, housing, education, and even more. And again, there's been some really good work. Juvenile Law Center is in the House, and they did some really good work on it. And JDC is in the House, and they're working on it right now. Where I work, Children and Family Justice Center, we've put out a lot of writing on this. So the more I do this work, juvenile justice work, the more that I feel like, wow, community-based post-arrest or pre-adjudication diversion is excellent, and I will always be a supporter of that. I think it's important and valuable. I also think it's important to say that when you divert after the point of arrest, it's in some ways it's too late, right? You've already created a criminal record on that kid. So to me, that's why a very important reform, even though I know the current administration has said we're not supposed to use the word reform, I think, but I'm going to say reform, is in this very technical area of having communities do everything we can to keep kids the hell out of the system in the first place. That is something that I feel really passionate about. Obviously, one way to accomplish this is not referring kids to the police in the first place, and I think there was some talk about the school resource officer, wolf in sheep's clothing, really police officers. So there's some really good work going on in the school context I could talk about with you later around restorative justice and trauma-informed work, therapeutic referrals instead of getting SROs involved. But oftentimes it's the police who are, in the first instance, either called to respond to whatever this behavior is or who come upon the youth in the community, right? Just to name some of the most common things statistically, teen behaviors that we see: fighting, shoplifting, possessing a joint, right? And this classic adage, am I saying it right? Of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Traditionally, what we've given police, they have a very small tool belt, and it's basically arrest, and that's their hammer, right? So we just arrest, and then we start talking about later on, oh wait, should we divert? No, we should be thinking about it before, right? Even station adjustments, which are traditionally what we think of as police's opportunity to divert, under our statute, you can only do it once you've already formally arrested a youth, right? You formally created that record. And I'm, again, more than happy to talk to folks about the life of records, fingerprints going all the way up to the FBI, getting stored, and really having devastating consequences down the line, even for mere arrests. So just quickly to tell you one example that I've gotten really interested in of what communities are doing to give police ways to divert without arresting. Pre-arrest diversion is, sometimes people call it the civil citation programs. They're starting to come up more frequently at the state level. We've got, for folks, if you're reporting in Florida, they just mandated by law that all jurisdictions have to create such a program. That law was passed on July 1st of this year. Last year, Delaware codified a pilot program that they had been working on. I think California's got something going. So it's happening in various places around the country. And just really quickly, what it looks like is essentially police are issuing tickets instead of arresting, right? So the consequences can be fines, fees, restitution, so they can be financial. Oftentimes they're services, referral to services. Sometimes it's a little bit of community service, and sometimes it's nothing. It's just the ticket, and you have to kind of go and be admonished, right? oftentimes in these civil citation programs right now, a lack of compliance can lead to formal processing in the system. So that's just a really quick overview of what these programs look like. A couple of the benefits of these programs, right? Obviously, it's decriminalization. You're holding youth accountable without creating an arrest record or any formal record on them. It's an opportunity to provide services that already exist in the community without pulling them into the system. It's much cheaper, so I don't have all the numbers, but I can tell you, for example, recently I was reading an ACLU Florida report that was saying a civil citation costs $386 for every, whereas a formal arrest processing is $5,000. That's one ACLU office giving you that stat, but it seems compelling to look into further. It seems worth our time. And one thing I've been working with police a lot lately around where I live, and one thing the police say a lot is that it saves them time and it allows them, it's less of a drain on their resources. It allows them to focus their resources on more important things happening in the community. Because if you think about it, whether it's an ordinance violation, a misdemeanor, or a felony, if you're going to arrest someone, you have to go through all of those steps of arrest. You have to transport to the police station, fingerprint, all of the paperwork that goes. If they can write a ticket in the community and be on their way, that saves their time and resources to do other things. A couple possible problems really quickly. Legislatures that have passed this have built lots of discretion for police into when to use these, right? So you have wide disparities, not only between jurisdictions, but between individual officers who maybe do or don't buy in to this particular concept. I know racial disparities don't exist anymore as of today, right? We're not keeping any more data, so we're done with that. But dare I say, you can imagine that there could be some racial disparities in who gets the benefit of a civil citation versus a referral to court and a formal processing. Most of these have a very limited eligibility, meaning that the way they're talked about is like first-time offenders can get this, this thing. And I think we've already lost the rhetorical battle right there, right? By calling someone who is, for example, shoplifted one thing out of a store, calling them an offender, right? They're an offender that's committed an offense. I have to tell you that one thing I do with my students is I have created my own rap sheet based on Illinois law, and I give it to my students. I would never qualify for one of these programs. I never would have qualified. And I never was arrested. I went to a good college. I'm a nice person. I'm a good mom. I work hard, right? But I would be an uber offender in the eyes of the law under the way these things are designed. So I find that to be a big problem with these. Obviously, fines are a problem. If fines are a part of it, then what you have is mom or dad of an affluent kid whipping out their pocketbook, writing a check, and if you're poor, then you end up in the system anyways because you don't deal with it. You can't deal with it. And also, if you don't complete your service and you end up getting arrested, there's that fear of net widening, right? That maybe you'll write a ticket for something that you would have just let go, but since you can write a ticket, but then if the kid then doesn't comply or doesn't pay or can't pay, then they're in the system. You fear that. I'll stop here. I do want to, at some point, and I can do it offline or later when we're chatting, I've gotten involved in my own community, which is Evanston, Illinois, where Northwestern is, just north of Chicago, in an alternative to arrest committee that's doing something similar, but I think a little bit more progressive, addressing at the front end some of these possible problems. But I want to stop talking for now. But I would love to talk about what we're doing in Evanston, which is sort of civil citation without all the bad stuff that I just listed as problems with civil citations.
Thanks. Why don't you guys grab that other mic so you can share that and we'll share this one. So I'll give you both a quick follow-up question and then throw it open to the audience. So this is, panel on community-based rehabilitation. Shaena, you mentioned the focus on medium and high-risk kids, so you didn't widen the net. And Carolyn, you talked about upfront diversion so that kids, get pushed away right even from the beginning. And I just want you to stay with the notion of unintended consequences and net widening for a second, and say maybe a little more about how to advise folks if they're covering these issues that all alternatives aren't the same. Some places say, yeah, we have a 95% success rate, and maybe that's because those kids really never would have penetrated the system. Can you just say a little bit more about, if you were sitting in their shoes, how to discern the difference between an organization that may be providing good services but really isn't keeping kids out of the system and one that's not? Like, how would you tease that out? And as a defense attorney, what concerns you when you're faced in family court with the potential for courts ordering services for kids or ordering conditions for kids that might never really have been facing incarceration in the first place.
So on the first question on net widening, I'm a recovering defense attorney, but I'll let Caroline answer those questions since I'm still in recovery. So on the net widening thing, so my organization has a policy of no reject, no eject, or no eject, no reject. So we believe in, we accept anybody who's referred to us, and our funding comes mostly from government contracts. So the government decides who to send to us instead of sending them to an institutional placement. And because of that, our program is very, very intensive. So if we get referred as a young person who doesn't need the intensity of services, because we have a no reject policy, we'll take them and work with them. But before we do that, we'll try to work with the government entity and say, I don't think this kid needs us. Give us the kids whose names you know, because you're the commissioner and you hear about this kid. Jake is doing this again, whatever his name is. That you hear that every commissioner knows those 4 or 5 kids in a system who are giving them the biggest trouble. So we really want to focus on the kids who are not going to get services because of the complexity of their cases, or the seriousness of their offense, or the disbelief that their family is a safe place for them to be. That when we do things differently, intensively for that family, we can actually achieve those things, even for kids who everybody else has kind of dismissed as bad apples or as failed out of programs or what have you. And on the flip side are programs that tend to get a ton of funding that are really what we call creaming. They're taking kids who are already probably don't need to be touched by the system, or all kids benefit. I mean, everybody's kids benefit from programs, whatever they are, if they're effective. But you can say, Father Boyle at Homeboy Industries says this better than I am. I'm just going to quote him. He says, you can work with the low-risk kids or low-risk people all day long, and you'll be successful every minute of every day. Or you can work with the higher risk and moderate, and high-risk people, and that's where you see change happen. So that's sort of the issue with net widening, is that we want to make sure that we're not just investing in programs that are set up to succeed because they're already working with kids who already have, what I had growing up, or you have a baseline of support that doesn't need to be added to by some other additional programming. So just thinking about that, so we don't want to widen the net so that more kids come into the system by funding programs that work for kids who don't need those programs, I guess is the best way of putting it.
Okay, so I'll just really quickly, as a defense attorney, courts ordering services. I'm all for high quality services, but I do everything in my power as a defense attorney to make sure that my kids that they get ordered the fewest services possible. Our motto is do everything we can outside of the system, right? So that doesn't mean, we're going to be doing our own, social history on our kids, forming a relationship, and trying to link them to services, but we're never going to ask the court to do that. We're going to try to find other ways. And, I'm spoiled in that I work in a legal clinic. We have a full-time social worker. We provide holistic advocacy, so we do have, time and resources to do that. But my bottom line on this is any service that a kid is ordered to do through the court runs too great of a risk of just driving them deeper and deeper into the system, and sort of screwing them on technical violations down the road. Maybe not the most professional way to say it, so don't quote that. I literally have had kids who have been in a residential placement, get sent to prison, for breaking a bed, for missing one meeting, right? I mean, the violations that we see are just head spinning. And once you're in it, it just can be incredibly hard to get out. So I want to minimize any chance of them being required to do anything by the court. In terms of quality of services or this net widening question, this is one thing I really love about the program that's happening in Evanston. So imagine it's like a civil citation program. It is a ticketing. They call them C tickets. They don't call them civil citations, but they call them C tickets. It was come to on this. We have an alternative to arrest committee that includes police and city leadership and defense attorneys and schools, community organizations. And what we've crafted and we're working on getting through the city council right now. We actually looked at the data and said, what are the most common offenses that we're seeing? What are they? And then we've created these other routes, this ticketing system for them. But there is no end result of net widening. There is no route. We have already said these are low-level offenses. We don't need to create this on-ramp into the system where you can end up just so deep in. We're just going to stop it right here. So they're going to have to go to an administrative adjudicator, right? If they're under 18, they can't get any fines. That's part of the rule. No fines if you're under 18, because we understand that kids, that it's the affluent kids' parents who pay and the poor kids who don't. If you're between 18 and 25, you can choose whether to just pay a fine and be done, or you can choose if you'd rather participate in a program and save your money. That's cool too. And the money's not insignificant. Like, I think our alcohol, open alcohol, is like $500. Marijuana is $250. That's fascinating, by the way. I think alcohol is twice as much as marijuana. College campus, right? And there's just no path to arrest if you're not complying with whatever the referral that's been given to you. It just means that they're going to keep your record longer, so you will have to disclose it longer. So instead, they've created a positive incentive for you to just do whatever they're deeming that you need to do and be done with it. And then there's actually a municipal expungement ordinance that was passed, so they'll expunge it. So it's like, get it done, and then you can actually say it never happened. And the last thing I like about it, in terms of not serving as a net widening, is that the referral happens with no stigma, right? So you think about a community, and you think about people becoming like known people in the community, known kids, known offenders. But this is the way these referrals go. They don't have the police stations, what am I trying to say? The stationary letterhead, right? It comes through. This kid is just getting referred in the way any kid might get referred in, right? The way a kid who's never been arrested, or not even arrested, but never had any problems, might go to therapy or counseling or take part in a community program at the YMCA, or might, we at Evanston High School, we have one big high school and everybody has community service hours, right? So they're getting referred in to one of these services, just like any other kid might, and the people providing the services don't know that this kid has had some contact with law enforcement, and so there's less of a chance of stigmatization and of drawing them in that way.
Sure. And I'll just add one quick point to that, which is that, like Shaena mentioned, there's a lot of effective community-based services, but as effective as they are, they're operating against a racist criminal justice system, and that's something that goes unsaid quite a lot, especially in the research space. And I'll give a quick example, I'll try and make it real quick, of a mentoring program that we evaluated in 2015 to 2018. It's called Arches, and it's based here in New York City. And it uses an innovative model called credible messengers. So people who have lived experience with incarceration are mentoring probation-involved youth, ages 16 to 24, and they provide mentorship over a 12-month period. And our evaluation found that the kids who are participating in this program we compared the kids who are participating in this program to a comparison group, and we found that kids who are participating in this program had almost a 70% lower reconviction rate than the kids in the comparison group. But we also found that kids in the group who participated in this program had a higher rearrest rate than the kids in the comparison group. And what we realized was that we didn't control for police presence in the neighborhoods where kids who are participating in this program live. So as effective as any community-based service can be, kids are still operating under a system that is working to undermine them, and that is, quite frankly, racist and classist.
All right, we're going to throw it open to questions. Yeah.
Before we do that, if we could, you went to Europe, right?
Yes.
To look at juvenile justice systems there. Will you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So a colleague of mine and I, the focus for us was on young adult justice, not for juveniles, but for kids that were just over what the U.S. line is of 18. And Croatia, the Netherlands, and Germany are 3 countries that allow kids beyond the age of 18 when they commit crimes to be treated as juveniles. Germany and Croatia, it's up to age 21. The Netherlands, it's actually up to age 23. So my colleague and I went to Croatia and the Netherlands. Germany's been doing this since 1953 when they had this fatherless, what they called the fatherless generation of kids that were running the streets after World War II, whose parents had been killed in the war, and they didn't gravitate towards institutionalization because of the Holocaust, so they allowed them to be treated as juveniles. Originally, it was like 20% of the kids were retained in juvenile court. Now it's 2/3 of the kids are retained in juvenile court. 90+% of the homicides and rapes are retained in juvenile court. Actually, the kids that go to adult court are more likely to be traffic offenses and property crimes because they don't really do much to them in adult court. They give them a day fine or make them do community service. They don't have the same kind of collateral consequences the U.S. has. We took 20+ Massachusetts legislators with us, including not just legislators, sheriffs, DAs, defense attorneys, advocates, 6 or so senators and House members, judges. And it was absolutely fascinating. I did write a series of blog posts in the crime report on it, and
So what did you find out that these countries are doing differently that you think are much more effective than what we're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult to discern effectiveness because Germany's been doing it since 1953, so you couldn't do pre-post analysis, and the other 2 countries, it's too new. But there's a lot of research about neurobiology, developmental psychology, even sociology in the U.S. that is suggesting that this young adult population has got a lot of similarities with juveniles. And, just think about sociologically when, 1960, 45% of people 18 to 25 were married. Now, 9% of people in that age group are married. For males, not for females, by the way, marriage is associated with less crime. For females, it actually slightly increases their likelihood. Kind of hitch ourselves to you guys. When we hitch ourselves to you guys, we get better. You hitch ourselves to us, you get worse. But we get a lot better when we get married. And also gainful employment. I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn, and my neighborhood was a very factory-driven, blue-collar neighborhood. When I graduated from high school, friends of mine were getting jobs in factories, and they also could beat stockbrokers on Wall Street. They could start just with a high school diploma. None of that's available to 18-year-olds in my neighborhood now. With those jobs, while I was going to college, my friends were getting their own apartments and getting married. You couldn't do any of that in my neighborhood now. Even if you got a job on Wall Street or in a factory, which all those factories are closed now, you couldn't afford an apartment in Greenpoint, which is where I grew up. So that has sort of elongated adolescence sociologically. As I said, lots of brain research shows that many of those things I described and developmental psychology about juveniles also apply to young adults. So that means 2 things. That means it mitigates their bad behavior, but also makes them more malleable and more able to be to sort of benefit from rehabilitative programs. And that is much more likely to be put into practice in Europe, and particularly the 3 countries we went to, but a bunch of other countries do other things to mitigate the impact of the adult criminal justice system on juveniles. And Massachusetts is one of 4 states considering raising the age of juvenile court to 21. Vermont got there first, and we're going to hear about that, I guess, tomorrow. You're all going to hear about that. So Vermont is the first state in the history of the country to allow kids up to age 20, till your 20th birthday, to be tried in juvenile court. And it would not surprise me if 1 or 2 or even 3 states, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Connecticut are the other states that have had bills to do this over the last several years. It wouldn't surprise me if 1 or 2 of them starts to raise the age even beyond 18. It's not uncontroversial like any new thing would be, but they seem pretty peaceful and happy in Germany. They wear the little laserhosen, they drink a lot of beer. So
what was the most dramatic contrast that you saw in Europe in terms of the way they're running particular juvenile justice programs or laws with the United States?
So one thing I thought was fascinating, we did go to one of their facilities, which actually has been written up quite a bit in the U.S., this Neustrelitz facility. And one of the impacts of raising the age to 21 is that the young ones aren't in lockups. So one of the things that our delegation was concerned about was what's a facility look like if it's got 14-year-olds and 24-year-olds, because the kids tried as adults up to age 21 can stay till I think their 25th birthday. So what's that going to be like if you have little kids and big kids, right? And as it turns out, there were no little kids because there were no 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds and a small number of 17-year-olds. So it essentially, and I'll get you, it essentially deinstitutionalized the system for younger juveniles, and by the way, nobody under 14 could be tried as even a juvenile, and it kind of young adultified at least their correctional system. So it was really a bunch of 17 to 23, 24-year-olds. And the facility conditions were incredible. They were doing things nobody would let their kids do here. They had wood shop where the kids were working with saws and screwdrivers. Like our sheriff almost fainted when he saw the stuff that they. And then they were in the culinary. Kids had big knives. They were carving up meat, and they don't have any problems. The kids had keys to their own rooms. Like we said, "Can you show us your room?" The kid said, "Yeah, sure. Let me get my key out." And everybody was like, "Whoa!" They were only locked from like the kids could lock and unlock the doors. You know, staff had the keys too, but they weren't locked into their rooms.
Yeah. So what's your takeaway from that?
I mean, I think we're on the advent of learning how much air is in the balloon of incarceration in America, both for kids and adults, and how much further we can go as a society. We've been in such a deep, dark hole for the last 30, 40 years that we don't even know we're in it. Like, when I took over the system in D.C., folks that I worked with, I'm sure they didn't come 25 years ago as people that sexually assaulted kids or sold them drugs or beat them up. But there it was 25 years later, and that's what they were doing. They were either doing those things or they knew about it because it wasn't that big a facility. It was only a 200-bed facility, so you can't have sex with kids in that facility without everybody else knowing. You can't sell them drugs. You can't beat them up. So everybody was either doing that stuff or they knew about that stuff. But I don't think they showed up that way. Maybe one or two of them were sadistic bastards who showed up that way. But by and large, I don't think they were that. I think they became that over time. Either they left or they acquiesced. And when you go to another society where you see, oh, wow, you can actually run correctional facilities without doing those things to people, or, oh, wow, you don't really have to lock up kids that are this age. You can actually, as you said, literally just send them home and provide them with help, and that the institutions could sort of gravitate towards older kids. That was very eye-opening for the delegation.
So was that the impression of the delegation?
Yeah. It was interesting. Like when people, we debriefed every day. We were there for like a whole week, and we were on a bus, and so every day I would be doing like a debrief with everybody. And the word possibilities was the word used the most frequently. People were just like, wow, I just never really thought about the possibilities of these other things. And I know the Vera Institute of Justice has done several trips over, and we talked to them in the process of doing this. They introduced us to some of the people that were super helpful. And that's what the impression of that group has been as well. It just, we are so stuck in this carceral state that we've built up around ourselves, and all of our public officials who have worked here. I mean, think about what it takes by and large. I was an exception. I ran nonprofits, and the mayor of D.C., in an act of what can only be described as absolute desperation, plucked me out of my nonprofit and hired me to run his system. But most folks running systems kind of came up in those systems. And most elected officials think that's a good thing. They have a resume with experience. They've been an assistant director, now they're a deputy director, and then they get to be a director. Maybe it is, but maybe it's also not, because maybe that 25 years of experience is 1 year of experience 25 times, and maybe they haven't gotten to see anything beyond their limited scope of experience. And I thought that bringing the folks from Massachusetts over there, a good, interesting range of folks, really allowed people's eyes to be open to different possibilities.
We have a lot of cultural perpetuation in the criminal justice system. Okay, folks, you got any questions?
I've almost forgotten mine, but I got a good one.
Where are you?
First of all, it's for Caroline. Go Cats. Northwestern. Yes. There are a lot of Medill people here.
You said Cubs, and I thought maybe you hadn't heard the bad news.
No. Go Cats.
We'll
You
get 'em next
mentioned
year.
you're talking to a bunch of journalists here who I assume we've all tried with varying levels of success to get access to juvenile records of offenders. I've got them leaked to me, written stories about them, but generally it's very difficult. And so you said that you got a juvenile record, it could screw them up in adult life. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, provide some examples of how that happened so that I have a better sense of, my impression was these things got expunged. They didn't follow you to adulthood. But then again, I covered a trial with a 17-year-old charged with murder, and he was acquitted. It was a big, long trial. And I went back to the courthouse, 3 months later, and one of the reasons they had used there was no more record of the trial having happened at all. No record at all. They had sealed the case because, in part, he was acquitted and he was a juvenile, which I don't know. I'm sure we'd win the First Amendment argument on that for public access, but I'm just curious what.
Yeah, I've been working with an organization in Chicago. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Around this question of releasing juvenile records to the media. But just to go back to your, I want to make sure I'm answering your question. So it was how are they getting out, right? So
You were talking about like the stigmatized.
right, that they're impacting, right?
I can't get them. I'm just curious how that happens.
Right. So there are a couple of ways. Well, there are a lot of ways, and sometimes we don't always know. We just know they're popping up, and we're trying to figure out the ways. But so there's lawful and unlawful, right? There's legal and illegal, unlegal. Use that word. So legally, when I talked about how through the 90s, our statutes, speaking for my own state, but I know this is a national issue, and I'm going to point you again to Jessica Fireman in the back of the room, who was part of a 50-state study about these issues or about laws around confidentiality and expungement of juvenile records. So, but just to use my own state as an example, we used to have a very limited group of, or list, a short list of individuals or entities that could access a juvenile's record, right? So it would be like the prosecutor, the probation officer, the child themselves, their parents, the judge, right? It's sort of the obvious players. That expanded dramatically. We put out a report in 2016 called Burdened for Life. The Illinois Juvenile Justice Commission put it out. I was one of the authors on the report. And we have some, I think, really good graphics that will make it really clear to you and that you can share if you're trying to explain it to other people about just how many entities and individuals legally can have access. Depending on the state, the media may or may not be one. In Illinois, the media used to be one under certain circumstances. Right now, that's been more limited, and we're trying to craft new language for, figuring out how to protect youth's identities while also not giving, for example, again, the great city of Chicago with some of our, police issues that we have going on, not giving the police a shield to hide behind and say, sorry, we can't let you see that record or that video of this, this police shooting, Laquan McDonald, it comes to mind, because, we're not allowed to release any kind of juvenile record. So we're trying to strike that balance of how to, have light shining in on system and process and also protecting kids' identities, because so that goes to one way. Once a record gets out, you've got all of these criminal data aggregators, right? So once the record is out, it's living online. We see a lot of times. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But so that's the first thing. It's just that there are, if you look at the statute in any state, there are lots and lots of people who now are legally allowed to have it. And in some states, I think, Jessica, you'll tell me if this is right, the default is that kids' records are public, and it's only when they turn 18 that they can seek to seal those records. So even though the myth in everyone's head or the general idea is, juvenile court's confidential, juvenile records must be confidential, and they must just go away. It's just not the case at all under the law. And that was, for me, that was a huge learning thing to know that in some states, they're literally public. At least in Illinois, we generally consider them sealed unless certain people have them. That certain people have the right to them, but not just everybody. But a lot of states, they're public. And then it's only when you turn 18 that you can seal. So you can imagine well, anyway, so that's legal. And then unlawful, we found just a lot of instances that we did about 150 stakeholder interviews, and we found a lot of instances of, these records that should not be out that are coming up on a background check, and you can see it, and we're trying to figure out how, and you have to surmise that somehow it got passed, right? We have like 11,000 leads terminals, these terminals, so a lot of people have access to the data itself. There are rules against sharing, but background check companies are popping up, and they need to distinguish themselves, to be able to say, well, we can get you information, that you're seeking, whether it's correct or not. So a lot of it is through there. We also found that a lot of information was coming out through FBI records. So that goes to sort of this idea of fingerprints. They get batched together, juvenile and adult. So, and then once they go up to the state level, they don't always get separated, and then they go up to the FBI level. And so you've got essentially inadvertently, so maybe not illegally, but inadvertently, you've got records of juvenile, say, mere arrests actually getting interpreted when an FBI rap sheet comes out. I think the DOJ report said about 50% of those don't have dispositions. So you see this, all you see is like aggravated battery, and they'll say it might be a juvenile arrest. It could be aggravated battery because I was 14 and I got in a fight at school. Aggravated because it was on a public way. But all you see as an employer or a landlord or whoever, you see aggravated battery, and you don't know, you assume it was an adult conviction, when in reality it was a juvenile record. We've also seen them coming out through the Secretary of State's office, and there are a lot of states have statutes where if you're found guilty of a juvenile offense, it goes on your master's. It's your master driving abstract, which is publicly available, and so that's like a weird sort of inadvertent side thing. So they're popping out left and right. Anyway, does that answer pretty much? We can talk more. Or check out the report, because we talk about it in the report too.
Hi, Jimmy. I work for the NPR station in Phoenix. I just wondered, could you tell us more about the Pay for Success program that you mentioned? The one there was one in Marion, Indiana, Marion County. And then I wondered, does the contractor get a lump sum after the child is released instead of a per diem? And if the old model is getting stuck in a transitional program, might the flaw with the Pay for Success program be like getting booted out before you got enough services or whatever? Like who's there to be like, success,
Yeah, let me try to answer your questions. So it was a partnership through MOUs and contracts, really, with government, and there was an anonymous funder and some foundations, and the Annie Casey Foundation was also one of the foundations that invested in this to help kind of give bridge money, if you will, because a lot of times systems will be like, we're interested in doing this, we want to help with this, but our money is currently tied up in the beds that we're investing in, that's where we're spending our money right now. So this was always, the Pay for Success was that if we were successful in achieving the target, which was like the 3,298 bed days saved, then that they would take that savings. So this is a little bit different than like an investor social impact bond where they get paid back. This was more like a grant from the foundations, if you will, right? So the state or the county in this case would then take the savings and use that to fund the program itself through a government funding program. And then take that savings and capture that same model statewide, which is what they're doing now. So it's not like we get, our cost per day is way less than the per diem cost for an institution. So the number I think was $242.51. Our cost per day is, I don't know the exact cost for that particular contract, but round about $75 a day. So that's also how the cost savings can be captured. Through things like spending less money on things that work better and are more sustainable and also help grow community capacity to keep kids safely at home. So it isn't like we would get a per diem. It's just it's a contract. We're not paid the same way as like an institutional fee. I don't know if that answers your questions or not.
Yeah, I understood. I thought it was like, I have a facility, and so instead of getting a per diem at the end of like 3 months, if I turn the child back over and I say, oh, look, we completed this programming, like then I get paid. I just didn't understand.
No, yeah.
Did you say it's getting rolled out throughout the whole state of Indiana?
Yeah, so they now have done like an RFP process to let it out throughout the state. So it's a competitive bid. So it's not just for us; it's for other providers also around the state who can do similar or the same service. And that's really a part of building a continuum of care in the community, having the community step up all over and being funded, that you're taking the money away from these expensive places and putting it in the community instead.
The juvenile justice systems tend to do a better job of reducing kids in confinement and reallocating money to communities. It's not always perfect. It's actually rarely perfect, but Reclaim Ohio, Redeploy Illinois, the realignments in Texas and California, the Close to Home initiative here. There's been lots of examples where, as the populations have declined, sometimes they even fiscally incentivize local jurisdictions, like in Reclaim Ohio, Redeploy Illinois, not to send kids by saying, if you send fewer kids, we'll give you more money to program those kids locally. So it's started to happen more with the adult system, but it really, I think, the juvenile system's the model to look at for that.
Hey, my name's Co. I'm at the Jackson Free Press in Jackson, Mississippi. And Carolyn, you were talking about your prosecutor who wants to keep kids out of the system from the get-go, but that's not the case.
Defense attorney.
I apologize. Yeah. No, it's not really. But regardless, you talked about wanting to keep kids out of the system from the get-go. That's not what I encounter a lot of the times in Mississippi, especially with kids who are poor. We're one of the poorest states, if not the poorest. We bounce from 49 to 50. Getting court-appointed attorneys and who sometimes don't file those waivers to give kids the opportunity to go back to youth court, whether or not a judge will accept it. And so I wonder if you guys could talk about just the role of prosecutors throughout the system and attorneys throughout the system, and how that, it falls into how people vote also, because the district attorney ends up having a large amount of power in terms of how people go through the system. I know it's a lot, but...
The role of lawyers in keeping kids out of the system?
And, because not all lawyers think that way. So what kind of do you do about that when you may not have a lawyer who, if you have a court-appointed lawyer who has ever even handled a juvenile case before but has to, and what kind of happens to kids in the community in that respect?
Yeah, I just was actually working with an attorney, a court-appointed attorney down in Kankakee County. I have a kid that I'm working on one thing with in Cook County, and then she was appointed down in Kankakee, which is hours away, so I wasn't able to go down there. And it was really eye-opening for me, how much she wanted to do her job. But as a court-appointed attorney, she was doing, literally 50 million things, and wasn't advocating for him strongly. Man, it's a big question. You mentioned the vote, right? You mentioned voting. I think we, installing people like we've installed in Philly. We've got Kim Fox in Chicago, getting people in powerful positions at the top that have a progressive mindset about right-sizing the criminal justice system, right? Which to me means downsizing the criminal justice system. I do think that that's huge. The older I get, the more I think it's all about the people who are, who are in charge. But I don't really know what to say about, I think a lot of folks lose their fighting spirit because they're in, they call it, sometimes you'll hear it called a work group, right? Like it's public defenders, prosecutors, you're going to work with the same people every day. And so you kind of stop, you're kind of an insider to what's going on, and there's horse trading, and there are different things that are happening. And I'm not sure what, to me, as a defense attorney, the answer is just always fight like hell, right? Know the resources that exist, know the ways, know the avenues where you can off-ramp your kid, where you can pull your kid out. You have to know the law. That's maybe one of the most basic things to say that I think not all attorneys really know, is that you have to know ways to pull your kid out of the system, and then just fight like hell to throw your body, in front of them going any deeper than they go. But in terms of how to spread that culture, you can find individual attorneys that have that mentality, and you can find offices that share that, that have more of that culture. But I do think installing people with progressive mindsets is the only way, really. And I think in some ways it really does come. Like we have a very progressive public defender in Cook County, but I think a lot of it, the tone is set by the prosecutor. Because they're the gatekeeper, right?
tomorrow, Marianne Scally is going to be speaking, and she's the executive director at the National Juvenile Defender Center. So you might want to, and she's sitting right at your table. So you might want to ask her that question too, because that's
You have a better answer
that's
than I can.
no. I'm not trying to say that, but
No, I am saying that.
but that's their bread and butter. They are actually working exclusively to sort of uplift defense for kids.
Okay, we're running out of time, and before we do, I'd like you to answer the please don't or please do when the journalists here are going to be writing juvenile justice stories. What do you hate when you see it in a story, and what do you like when you see it in a story?
I feel like you should take moderator's privilege and share.
I'll take moderator's privilege. I hate oversimplification and using sort of aberrant cases as emblematic of anything. And I really love nuance. I've seen some terrific reporting where reporters were able to sort of get behind what made a thing happen rather than just talk about the thing. And that kind of texture to a story, I think, really helps the public understand, even if it's confusing, even if there's no easy answer. In fact, especially if there's no easy answer, I think that's the best kind of reporting. I know you don't always have time to do that. Sometimes you got to rush down there. There's the yellow tape. There's the flashing lights. You got to file by the next day. But every once in a while, if you get a chance to dig deep and help people really understand what's making young people tick or what's making a system be as messed up as the system is, or what are the challenges the system faces, that I think does a much better job of educating the public than just the overnight stuff.
Yeah, please, all of you.
Okay, I'll say really quickly. I have a million pet peeves, but I'll just talk about a couple. I mean, don't ask a New Yorker to complain because we'll be here all day, right? But I think one is that we tend to look at kids when they're in the justice system as just kids who have offended, and not also kids who may have been victims or survivors of crime. And they seem to lose that status, and then we put victims on they have a pedestal because they've been victimized, but our kids who've also been victimized or lost loved ones to serious crimes seem to we don't look at them that way anymore. They've lost all empathy because of what they've done. And I think that is a pet peeve for me because it doesn't contextualize really the true story. It doesn't help us get to the answers. My other one is just thinking, really challenging again, that when we close a youth prison or a facility, what we do next doesn't have to be some other type of facility, to really challenge policymakers, for reporters to really challenge themselves and policymakers on what else is there besides another facility. And the last one is a focus just on evidence-based programs, because I think there's a million things that are happening in communities that are working and organizations that don't necessarily have dollars or resources to grow their evidence base, and they get excluded. They get not to be part of the solution, and they absolutely should be. So those would be my three. Can I go?
Sure. I'll keep it short and sweet, but it's sort of...
Me like I'm pushing.
No. Well, I'm looking at you because the point that I'm going to make is sort of building off of yours, and it's that it's really easy to take one example or one model and claim that this is how you reform the system. And I think in the case of probation, juvenile probation, I think jurisdictions need to decide for themselves whether or not, what types of assets they have and what resources they have and how they will be making decisions within their jurisdiction. But context matters in that case. There's no end-all, be-all decision that will work for every county around the country. That's my pet peeve.
And I'll just wrap it up. I would say I hate labeling and I love humanizing. So I think we live in a world, particularly when you're thinking about the juvenile justice system, where a lot of our population has the luxury of not having to actually know kids involved in the juvenile justice system beyond a stereotype. And I think the media has a lot of power in sometimes contributing to the stereotype and also challenging the stereotype and forcing your reader to see whoever you're reporting on as a human who is complex and multifaceted and not playing into that stereotype.